Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Frontline Advantage. We have a very exciting guest today, Larry Williams Jr., who joins us from Union Base. I first met Larry when I heard him speak at an Aspen Institute event on economic opportunities programs. Larry and I have had continued dialogue, and we thought it would be great to actually get him on the Frontline Advantage to learn from him today. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome, Larry.
Thank you, Vivek. Really happy to be here today. Thanks.
Larry, I want to start with actually understanding where we are in the context of the unionization movement here in the country. There was an event put on by Red Thread Research at the end of last year, and it was their 2025 Trends webinar. And one of the slides that they put up was the number of work stoppages involving 1,000 workers or more, looking at it from 2014 to 2025 by each month. And if you look at that chart, you can see consistent increase over time of these work stoppages. They also address things around how to actually respond, one of those components being co-creating solutions with key partners, which is what Teamforce is all about in general, co-creating solutions with your workforce. But I want to talk a little bit about how did we get here and what do you see going on with the labor movement in the country today?
You know, it really depends on how far back you want to go. And I'm curious how they're defining work stoppages because, the National Labor Relations Act was passed in 1935, and it governs the relationship between employers and workers, but not just that, but also what activities employers and unions can engage in both the organizing process, but also in activism in the workplace. And so that particular type of activism it falls under the tag of concerted activity. So when workers decide to do something like walk off the job or, do a picket, something like that, that type of activity is actually protected by the National Labor Relations Act. And so, if they're doing it to improve their wages, hours, or working conditions, they are allowed to do so as long as it falls within certain guidelines and doesn't, break certain rules. I think what's happened actually in the last, 4 years, 5 years, since COVID and even a little bit before that, is that workers have been feeling a lot of pressure economically. This is no secret. And I think, really over the last 30 years, wages have not kept up with productivity, which is a big measure for employers about how they're doing business wise. And so because of that, and obviously because of the extreme inflation, workers have become very unsettled about a lot of things. And then you have workers doing what they think is useful to try to change the situation. I think a lot of folks, if whether it's Starbucks, Amazon, there's literally dozens of very high profile things happening in terms of workers. Those things are sort of an expression of internal conflict in the organization. And then on the other hand, you have some organizations where workers have a better relationship with their employer and it's not quite as contentious. You don't ever hear about that, right? The successful bargaining, the situations where workers are actually supporting management or whatever, you just hear about the conflicts. And I think that that's partially a nature of the sort of reporting, because when I was a union leader, what you would only time you would be able to get media to care about what you were saying is if you were going on strike. And I think that's still similar today.
So if yours a pie chart of the reasons that work stoppages are occurring, and you had to fill in different components around wages, fair grievance procedures, safety, having a voice. Do you have a sense of what the composition of that typically looks like that's causing or getting people to this frustration where they have to stop working or they believe they need to create a unionized effort drive?
Yeah, for sure. Wages, working conditions, and, those wages and working conditions are always the top of the list. But one really underrated category is respect, because really a lot of the decisions management makes adds up to the level of respect that employees feel. Do they feel like they have a voice in decision-making processes that relate to their lives? And that could mean, leave. Recently, there was a really good post on Indeed where one of the employees at Indeed was thanking the CEO for a really good leave policy. And I know Chris Hames is a very progressive person when it comes to workers' rights and trying to improve how their workplace respects, both men and women in leave, right? And they have a very generous leave policy. And this may seem like a very technical thing. How many days do you get? How do they accrue? But really, what it comes down is to, do they have respect for the employees and for the sacrifice that they make for the company? I think that also the narrative. I don't know how much of this is media narrative, but I know that some of this is reflected in attitudes. But like a lot of the sort of narratives around workers is this like quiet quitting or loud quitting, these sort of trendy TikTok things, which I don't think are necessarily helpful for a productive workplace, right? Because then you have employers that are suspicious of what employees are doing when they're remote working. And then you have employees feeling like maybe nothing is good enough, right? No matter what happens, the workplace is always going to suck, which is not really, I personally don't think that that's correct. You can always do things to improve a workplace on both sides.
So it sounds like wages is the component that a lot of people like to focus on the most. Yet we know that there are organizations that pay competitively and still have a number of issues with their workforce. In fact, they may even pay above market. And you touched on some of these, respect being a big component of that. Why do you think organizations struggle with this idea of respect? And maybe it ties into this broader notion of when these work stoppages occur, when they see unionization efforts, why do they take a more combative approach or an approach where they maybe try to prevent people from being able to express themselves? What's the genesis of that? Why do they still behave that way? Is it cultural? Is it a mindset? And what suggestions or advice do you have for organizations that may be listening to this that are currently dealing with what we saw on that slide? They're seeing an increase perhaps in stoppages, or they're seeing unionization efforts. What advice would you give them?
Yeah, I've been an executive director a couple times in my career, so I can actually relate and understand where some of that might be coming from. Because when you're in management, your job, let's say you're at the top of the organization, you're the CEO, you're the executive director, or COO, whatever. It's sort of like the buck stops with you, and you're seen as responsible by your boss, which is the board or the shareholders, for what happens in the organization. And so the perception is that if you allow the workers to have input on the decision-making process, then you're ceding power. When in reality, what actually happens when you include your employees in the decision-making process on certain things, then you're actually bringing them into the decision-making process. You're helping them understand why there are certain challenges to making decisions, which in a lot of cases can take the pressure off of you. I was actually the first president of Progressive Workers Union. It represents, staff at the entire Sierra Club now, as well as 350 Greenpeace, Union of Concerned Scientists, League of Conservative Voters, I believe. But we started off as a very small union, and we organized and ended up representing a lot of staff in the environmental nonprofit movement. Once we started being involved in the decision-making process through labor management committees, through regular conversations with HR, we understood a lot better the context and why they were making those decisions. And we were able to come up with really good, I think, cogent solutions to these problems that maybe they didn't even know the problem existed, that were getting bottlenecked with middle managers and making people quit really quickly. So I think part of it is rooted in fear. Some of it is partially rooted in how people, like I said earlier, have been taught in business school or have been taught through their professional career how to deal with sort of conflict in the workplace, which is like conflict avoidant, or just get rid of the person who is not like working with you. Whereas there are other ways to do so. And management is hard. People don't like to say this, but being a good manager is hard. It's easy to be a bad manager, but it's difficult to be a good manager.
Yeah, and you talked a little bit about the perceptions. In some ways, do you think it's really having to do with a misunderstanding and communication gap, where it gets so contentious that people feel like they have to strike or take these steps that management may see as contentious, but it's really because perhaps they're not feeling heard, they're not feeling valued, they're not feeling recognized. And if organizations would actually focus on ensuring their people feel valued through consistent feedback and listening and co-creating solutions, they could actually have better relations that benefit their business and avoid these contentious types of relationships. And maybe another way of asking it is, are unions primarily a result of frustrations that are occurring, or are there other reasons unions are being formed in the country right now?
Having channels to collect feedback are extremely important, especially in large corporations where there's multiple layers of management. Again, like I said, things can get bottlenecked. And so having a channel to collect information, whether it's through technology, whether it's through process or process and technology, which I would recommend not leaning totally on technology, but having some sort of system that you have ingrained into the whole organization and you make a culture of communication, that's extremely important. In terms of unionization and why people are unionizing, absolutely. I mean, sometimes there's frustration. I'd say, I don't know what percentage, but quite a bit of the people who are unionizing are doing it out of frustration. But what I'm trying to get people to understand is that unionization is a fundamental right. Some say it's even a human right that is, it is protected concerted activity, right? That is what unionization is. So if you decide to join a union, it's completely within your rights. It's just not necessarily normalized in the United States like it is in the Nordic countries, in Paris, and other countries. They have extremely high unionization. And that unionization means that it's pretty normalized. It's not necessarily a thing as a bad thing if you get unionized. That's really here in the United States. But what I remind people is that people are unionized across sectors: nurses, teachers, professional athletes, right? You have the NFL Players Association. You have almost every league has a union. Even the WNBA has a union. People don't know that. So this is something that's like sort of a quietly very, very well. Some industries are quietly very well represented, and some are not as much. And that's why you see a lot of news around it when people in a different industry are unionizing. But it doesn't mean you're a bad employer because you're unionized necessarily. It could just mean that the industry standards are really low and people wanted to bring them up.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's really helpful to kind of get context. I remember reading about an effort at Costco at the end of 2023, and there was a letter sent out by the then CEO and former president, now current CEO, Ron Vatras. And you can see they talk a little bit about, in a way, it sounds like their disappointment that they had a location go union. But as you're talking about, that's not necessarily anything reflective of the organization. Now, in this case, there was some talk about the reasoning behind that. One of those components being having a voice, as you talked about, on the job respect. Some might say Costco pays pretty competitively. And so it's not always just the wages. It's these other factors that can be at play. And I think that's the kind of thing that we often try to think about is how can we create better lines of communication between management or the people at these tops of these organizations and the people who are on the front lines doing a lot of the heavy lifting and the hard work. And rather than thinking about it in a contentious way, where you're sitting on opposite sides of the table, thinking about it, both of you sitting on the same sides of the table, saying, how can we collectively win to create, the best organization possible to help achieve top line revenue growth while in parallel reducing employee turnover, decreasing safety incidents, increasing productivity, increasing innovation, making it very much a we type scenario. Can you think of organizations that have unions that have successful relationships here in the US? You talked a little bit about the success in the Nordic countries or how it's more normalized. Do you see a trend in the US where unionization will continue to increase, even though I know it's at a bit lower level than it's been historically? You're seeing those work stoppages. Or where do you see the movement going in the future, given you spent some time in the space and have some context and background?
Yeah, I spent 15 years in the space, almost a professional lifetime. I think that I love to use UPS and the Teamsters as an example. I mean, every now and then, like every 4 years when the contract expires, they always have a little noisy, we're gonna negotiate. We might have to go on strike, but really, I mean, no union actually wants to strike. This is a bluff that you have to be serious about. You have to show that your members are very engaged and they care deeply about getting a good contract. But in reality, it's like what you said, like you want to be negotiating, yes, across the table, employer and union, but you want to be negotiating in a way that is I say positive negotiation, where you want to get a deal and you want to get language that works both for the employees and for the organization. And here's what I mean by that. Let's say the union wants a 20% wage increase, but the employer is saying, hey, we can't afford that. And here's all of our numbers to prove that. Okay, great. As a union leader, I'm going to say, we looked at it with our numbers folks as well, and we agree with you that this would be very difficult given our reserves and what we're trying to do as an organization. So let's break up that 20% raise. Let's make it 10% in the first year, and then we'll break it up 5%, 5% over 4 years, right? Maybe in the last year of the contract, if we meet certain targets, then we'll make it a 10% increase so that we get everything that we were looking for. If you're a good union, you're a good union leader, then you're going to try to figure out ways to make deals that are in agreement. That's just one example, because wages are usually the toughest things to make a deal on. But there's other kinds of policy that you can make compromise on both sides, because both sides have to make compromises to get to a deal. Those types of compromises, as long as they make sure the business is still running efficiently and that, you know, you're not just bringing in dead weight or anything like that, are really healthy, and they're good for the morale of the organization, because they let people know that you care. In terms of industries that might increase unionization, I mean, we've been seeing it really, I want to say in all industries in some degree, but in terms of what's emerging, we should be thinking about the industries that are the new industries that are coming about. For example, people don't think about the fact that AI actually requires work. There are people who review the content that is put into AI, and those folks are people like teachers, writers, people who have a really good work well with words. Those types of folks, I think, might be the new union members of the future. A lot of that work, unfortunately, is done overseas in Africa and other places where they're forced to look at very difficult imagery and writing and things like that. But the work that is done here is done in places like Texas and other places where there's not a lot of regulation. And so those people work really, really hard and get very low pay for the amount of money that's being raised on the VC side, and that's being made by AI. So I think a lot of those folks might be future union members with unions like the Communications Workers of America and other the American Federation of Teachers, unions that are used to representing people in those types of industries. But I do think that, realistically, the unionization numbers are not increasing that much. They're actually still declining, and people never really talk about that. But for the labor movement to really grow, there'd have to be a massive organizing effort, one that is coordinated. We did recently see this week that the SEIU, the Service Employees International Union, recently joined the AFL-CIO, which is the American Federation of Labor. It's the biggest federation in the entire country. It's a longer story for a different podcast for us, but SEIU and a bunch of other unions left the AFL-CIO a number of years back for multiple reasons, which we don't have time to discuss. But I'll just say you're starting to see unions thinking differently than they used to about how to approach how they work as organizations. And there's people like me also working to help the labor movement to evolve in terms of, how they think about organizing, how they think about working with employers and things like that.
Yeah. So it sounds like people need to feel like their employer cares about them, values them in a sense where if AI is coming and we have this skills gap where we have people that need to be trained into different areas, those organizations that actually focus and are people centric will do much better than those that are, again, seeing their people as labor that can be automated away with AI. And what advice do you have for a lot of these organizations, especially because top of mind or topic du jour is robots, humanoid robots, AI, automation? We're seeing the rate of change around this technology moving faster and faster. Being based here in Silicon Valley, there's a ton of buzz, but it's very hard to predict what that will all look like for humanity, for jobs, for society. What do you sort of imagine where things are going to be going?
Well, on the question of AI, I mean, I think that, we're actually producing a lot of content around jobs and AI on Union-Base, actually, because it's a big conversation that I don't think many folks are approaching from a labor perspective. Obviously, you really can't stop the development of technology. We're talking a lot about regulation. A lot of folks in the tech world don't necessarily like a regulation. They feel like it's a limitation on what they can do. But I do think the software, because that's what it is at the end of the day, software, should be developed with humanity in mind, as opposed to let's just build whatever we think is good and then see what happens. Like, we have to have intentional building. And, in terms of jobs going away, I've been thinking quite a bit about this. And I think as opposed to thinking about it in terms of jobs that are going to disappear, because someone did a really good video I'll actually be publishing in a week or so about how a lot of folks in Silicon Valley think that this is the first time in history technology isn't being made to make workers more efficient. It's being made to do things completely without workers. And so there's a lot of people who see AI as a way to make their work more efficient, make themselves quicker. And those folks are obviously going to benefit. But we need to be thinking creatively about how the technology will change industries. Because at the end of the day, is it the AI itself that's taking the job away? Or is it the changing of an industry? Is it the changing of the availability of certain tools? Great example, the horse and carriage, right? What does it
Mm-hmm.
look like if the horse and carriage is challenged by the truck or the car, and we say, no, 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 we shouldn't have any cars or trucks because people won't have horse and carriages anymore. There's still horse and carriages, it's just a lot less of them. It's like a novelty thing, right? But now there's jobs fixing trucks and cars. There's all kinds of jobs building freeways. There's all kinds of jobs. There's so many things that have been created. So how do we intentionally work together, those of us who are worried about the jobs and those of us who are building the AI, to build with intention and a forethought to create productive work in the future?
Yeah, it's a great topic and thing to think about. And I agree with you with like the Industrial Revolution. There was a lot of this concern as well. And, uh, people have found different ways to be creative and add value in society. And so it's always tough when living through the change because so few generations live through multiple changes. So it's hard to be able to understand and relate to it as you were talking about. But being mindful of how it affects people in humanity, being understanding if there is going to be regulation, being aware of the importance of reskilling and upskilling people, and the nature of this is all quite important. Is there anything else you want to share with the audience around things that you're thinking about related to unions, labor, AI, automation, and more?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to be careful with the upskilling conversation, because remember, the whole thing a few years ago was, oh, we just need to teach people to code and, they'll become coders. And look at this now. I mean, AI really is replacing coders. Not completely, obviously, because it's not perfect. And there's a lot of problems that come with using AI to create code. But I can tell you, as someone who was a developer for a short amount of time and still use code every now and then, that it's kind of incredible that I used to have to spend a half a day trying to research a problem that I was stuck on, building Union-based, the first version of the platform years ago. Now I can go to GPT, dump the code in there, and have it search the whole web for an answer, and then tell it to explain to me like I'm five, and it'll do that. It's just incredible. Now you can look at that two ways. On one hand, it can make you a better coder. On the other hand, it can make you lazy, right? So there's a lot of challenges there, and I think that we have to be open to the thought that there might be some jobs that may go away, and not be insensitive about that, and not just say, oh, you'll be fine, you'll find something else, right? We need to think practically about this. I'm reminded about the conversation of just transition. This is big in the environmental world, where when you're shutting down a coal plant because it's terrible for the surrounding communities, and all these people are getting iron lung and all these other illnesses from living next to a coal plant, of course I want to shut that down as an environmentalist, especially when they're in communities that are historically beat down. They're poor communities, etc. But then you think about the fact that some of those people work at the plant, and now they're not going to have any income, and now the tax base is going to be destroyed for a generation. So what is the just transition away from that coal plant? Can we rebuild something there? Can it be jobs cleaning it up? Can it become something that is renewable, sustainable, business sense, that helps the community and doesn't just leave them in a bind? We need to be thinking the same way when it comes to AI and labor.
That's fantastic. Larry, as we wrap up, we have a community section on our website at Teamforce where we talk about different people, both current customers and prospects can reach out to. Tell us a quick spiel on Union Base and why it would make sense for anyone in our network to reach out to you.
Yeah, look, Union Base was founded back officially in 2015, but it was an idea as far back as 2008, 2009. We started as a startup. We were featured in Lean Startup in the very beginning. I think you can still find that online. And ended up getting featured in 2017 in Fast Company and Forbes and a bunch of other places because we were the first social networking platform for unions. Obviously, social networking sort of fell out of favor with most of the world because of the sort of negative things associated with it. And then we pivoted last year, 2024, to be more of a sort of educational platform and newsletter specifically for AI, unions, and the future of work because of conversations like what we're talking about right now, which are amazing. And I'm so grateful that you invited us here to have this conversation. So if you're excited to learn more about this, if you want to hear from some really amazing speakers, we have congressmen, we have union presidents and athletes. We have all kinds of folks involved in the union movement, but we'll also have people who are involved in investing and developing AI. If you're interested in hearing from both labor and management, and you want to hear about how to use AI and what we can do to have a better world as it becomes everyday reality, go to UnionBase, subscribe, maybe even upgrade your subscription so you can get some exclusive content. But I hope you invite me back here again, and I hope your audience got something good out of this conversation.
Well, I'm excited to continue the dialogue for sure, Larry. I think we've got some great things we can touch on. And ultimately, we're trying to benefit humanity and do what's best for the world and the people that are in this world. So this has been fantastic. Thank you for coming on, and look forward to chatting with you more.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.